Hello and welcome to The Scoop, NANP's monthly Hot Topics educational webinar series. I'm Shannon Montoya, and I want to first remind you of a few things before we get started. I just want to remind you that these calls are recorded to listen to again at your availability by going to the nanp.org website. You can also find our upcoming webinar schedule on the new website, and you can check out what's ahead there. You can actually register early these days. You can also earn a continuing education credit for participating in Scoop webinars and by taking the corresponding quiz that can be found in the membership area of the new website. I would also like to invite you to share your hot educational topic with NANP, your clinical research, starting up businesses, nonprofits, anything you'd like to share that would pertain to our nutrition professional community. Let me know. I'm always happy to hear what's going on. And for today, the webinar will conclude with a question and answer session. So feel free to type in your questions throughout the webinar so we can get to as many as possible. And today our guest is Niki Gratrix, who is an internationally known registered nutritionist and in 2005 co-founded one of the largest mind-body clinics in integrative medicine in the United Kingdom. She worked as the director of nutrition there until 2010, and this was a clinic that specialized in treating chronic fatigue syndrome. And they won some really outstanding practice awards from the complementary and alternative medicine community, and they also published a preliminary study in 2012 on the results of patients, and that was published in the British Medical Journal. So Niki, we are really happy to have you with us today. This is a very interesting topic, the adverse effects and its impact on health across a lifetime. We've been looking forward to this for quite a while. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Shannon. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad that you're connecting with me on this topic, which is such an important topic, and it's also possibly one of the most underexposed risk factors that are affecting really everybody that comes into your clinic. So essentially, we are going to be talking about stress, but we're going to be talking about stress as in early life stress. Most people don't realize the majority of the stress that they have in their life and also how they respond to stress as an adult is actually defined by and set up, if you like, in childhood. So we refer to early life stress as, we talk about adverse childhood events, so trauma in childhood, and we call these ACEs, adverse childhood events, and this is what I'm going to be talking about, ACEs and the impact on health across the lifetime. So most people won't realize that if you're exposed to ACEs in childhood, that's adversity in childhood, first of all, 67% of all adults say they've been exposed, and of those, 80% or more have had more than one ACE or adverse childhood event. That's if you have a high level of ACEs in childhood, you have an increased risk of 7 out of the top 10 causes of death. If you have ACEs in childhood, you have a 6-fold increased risk of illnesses like chronic fatigue. And people with 6 ACEs, for example, have a 20-year reduction in lifespan compared to people with no ACEs. So where am I getting that data? I'm getting the data from studies that started in the mid-1990s, which are some of the most important studies in medicine that really everybody should know about. So it was the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. First one was like 1998. 17,500 adults replied to the survey. This was conducted by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. So what else did these statistics show? First of all, they defined the categories. When we talk about ACEs, what exactly were the researchers looking at? Well, they defined 10 categories as the first one was parents separating or divorce, physical, sexual or emotional abuse, physical or emotional neglect, domestic violence, mental illness in the family, substance abuse, or incarceration by a family member. So each one of those, that counts as one ACE. So what else did that study find? So, for example, if you had 4 ACEs, your relative risk of things like chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder is 2.5 times higher, hepatitis 2.5 times higher, depression 4.5 times higher, cancer 2.5 times higher, diabetes 1.6, stroke 2.6. Suicidal, the risk of being suicidal with just 4 ACEs was 12 times higher. If you had 8 ACEs, you have triple the risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of heart disease, the top 2 killers in the West. Dr. Felitti and Dr. Ander, the original researchers, came back in 2009 and did a huge study looking at ACEs and autoimmune diseases. Actually, was looking at sort of almost 17,000 people again in this study. When they were looking at autoimmunity in the Th1 dominant conditions, if you had just two ACEs, you had a 70% increased risk. And there's the list of the Th1 dominant conditions. Th2 dominant conditions, just 2 ACEs, 80% increased risk. Most people don't realize that for ACEs, women who have ACEs, autoimmunity in adulthood is strongly linked to smoking and lung cancer. It's a very interesting area to look into. Autoimmunity is obviously a female-dominant illness, and the statistics do show that you're 50% more likely to have ACEs if you're a woman. So there could be some correlation there as well about why autoimmunity is a female-dominant illness. Here's some other statistics. This came from a survey of 28,000 adults in California, gathered by the California Department of Public Health, sponsored by the CDC. Again, if you have 4 ACEs, you are over 4 times as likely to develop things like Alzheimer's and dementia. So ACEs affect everything, mental health, everything. Really, chronic fatigue syndrome, CFS, chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, I call them the poster children of ACEs in childhood. It's how I got into doing this research on adversity in childhood. If you have ACEs in childhood, you have a 6-fold increased risk of chronic fatigue if you have ACEs, like I mentioned. So you can't really work with chronic fatigue patients and not understand about the trauma in childhood and how that's affecting their biology in adulthood as well. So here was the original study done in that 2006. They were saying it was somewhere between a 3- and an 8-fold increased risk. They were looking at 43 cases of CFS. They repeated the study 2009, this time looking at 113, so they doubled the size, confirmed it and said, look, 6-fold increased risk of CFS. Fibromyalgia is the same, very high level of higher than arthritis. 62% of 205 women with fibromyalgia actually reported sexual abuse in childhood. So it's a huge area again where you can't ignore the trauma that's happened if you want to successfully work with these illnesses. Obesity, highly correlated as well. Here's a huge study of obesity of over 112,000 people. Mild abuse, you have about a 34% increased risk of obesity in adulthood. Severe abuse, you're 50% more likely to be obese in adulthood. I want to go into why 67% prevalence that this study first came out with was actually an underestimate. First of all, the researchers missed many ACEs, and we'll talk about those. They ignored the fact that trauma is intergenerationally inherited, and it also happens prenatally, and they wouldn't have asked that in their questions. It ignores what we call highly sensitive types. This is the group that are more likely to be impacted biologically by trauma. And it also ignored what we could call, or what sort of researchers and people like me in the area are calling covert trauma, or what we call silent ACEs. Because essentially the questionnaire design was too superficial to elicit certain answers. I mean, if you just ask somebody, you know, how was your childhood? A lot of people just go, well, it was great. The same way when you ask, as a nutritionist, you ask somebody, how's your diet? And they go, pretty good. And then you spend, you know, you look at their diet for 3 days and find out, oh, there's a whole load of things there that you find that are out of balance. And you would know that as a trained professional, whereas it's hard to ask your client or patient that, and they're not necessarily going to express what you would find. So missed ACEs, these are the types of things that have been missed before the age of 18 years old. The researchers, Dr. Felitti and Dr. Andy, you know, they didn't expect to get the results they did. They did this study by mistake. They uncovered a hidden crisis. They weren't intending to do an exhaustive list of ACEs. They were just thinking they just found 10 that had research behind them and that they could look into. But there's plenty of others, and I get emails all the time when I do these talks all over the place, and people say, well, I was bullied, there's racism, there's homophobia, does that count? Yes, it does. There's things like physical trauma requiring hospitalization, very traumatizing for small children. Witnessing violence, death of a caregiver, a traumatic birth is a huge traumatic effect that can impact somebody over a lifetime. Trauma that comes on to financial crisis linked with homelessness. And yes, of course, natural disasters, rarer than the others, but obviously they would count. So there's missed ACEs, so there's people, if we included all the people that experienced this, 67% prevalence is probably higher. The other fascinating area, I could do a whole webinar just on this, is that trauma is intergenerationally inherited. It's been known for a long time that third-generation survivors of the Holocaust victims have the same psychological and physiological changes in their biology and psychology as their grandparents. And it goes down into the progeny of many more than one level of offspring. This has also been found worldwide where there's been war or famine. The progeny is also carrying the trauma that occurred by their grandparents or parents. So when we ask people, have you had ACEs in childhood, they also need to consider what's going on with mum and dad, what happened to grandparents as well. And who hasn't had a grandparent in Europe, for example, who wasn't involved to some level with a war? This has been somewhat controversial to talk about, but it shouldn't be, because the hardcore science is really coming through in mainstream journals. So this is a fantastically interesting study where they actually showed it's epigenetically passed down. So trauma changes the epigenetics of the body and is passed down to the progeny. And this was in mice, and they found that in male mice that were traumatized, the RNA expression changes. They took the I call it the traumatized sperm, the RNA that's expressing differently, injected that into healthy, untraumatized eggs, female eggs, and the progeny had the metabolic changes that reflect trauma. So by doing that, they actually managed to rule out bad parenting as well. So it doesn't just go down the paternal line, it also goes down the maternal line. We could have done a whole webinar on just this, and there's more and more studies coming out on this. So it's a fascinating area. Highly sensitive types is the people who are less resilient. So, trauma is a subjective thing. It's something that happens to us, and at the time, if we don't have the resources to deal with it, it will stay in our psyche and it will be stored in the body. And what traumatizes one person may not traumatize another. In many ways, it's not so much what ACEs events happened, it's what your level of resilience to them was at the time. So a mitigating factor when an ACE happens is having social support or someone with you at the time who could help you process it. Lots of people around with ACEs who are happy and healthy in adulthood. So they would have had mitigating factors. What will make you less resilient is it looks like there's single nucleotide polymorphism, SNPs that 15%, up to 15% of the population have. One is called the sensitivity gene. It's 5-HTT-LPR. This is related to serotonin metabolism. It means we don't bounce back quite so fast from a trauma. Serotonin doesn't bounce back so fast, so it will take longer to recover. And the other one that's being looked at is a fascinating area is the stress vulnerability gene, NR3C1, which means that in face of trauma or stress that we have higher cortisol for longer. So those two groups potentially, that's being linked with the chronic fatigue syndrome group, by the way. Very interesting area for clinical nutritionists to start looking at as perhaps modulating that or bypassing, doing a nutritional bypass to help somebody stay calmer. So, and I'm going to dig in a little bit deeper than I've done in previous talks. So I know I'm going quite fast. You might have to come back and listen to this webinar again. You're going to have the slideshow. The reason I'm going a little bit fast is I want to include a little bit more data than I usually do about these silent ACEs and the kind of what we're calling the silent epidemic of developmental attachment trauma. And this relates to questions to do really with emotional neglect and emotional abuse, where it's very hard for people to self-report in a survey they actually had issues, because it's not a single discrete incident. So attachment trauma, it's also being called developmental trauma, is a relational trauma where there isn't good bonding with the primary caregiver. So, and it's not a single incident, it's sort of ambient, it's going on, it's how life is at home all the time. So specifically attachment trauma occurs in the first 1,000 days between conception to age 2 It's the time before the thinking brain comes online, so it's in the front, it's before the frontal cortex develops. So a child that age can't even verbally express what happened to them. It doesn't qualify as a PTSD diagnosis, and that's very important. PTSD requires single incident and has different symptomology. So attachment trauma occurs essentially when baby doesn't securely bond with mum. Baby and mum aren't resonating, there isn't emotional bonding occurring. This research, this big studies that everybody who's a health practitioner should know about, and they were called the Strange Situation Studies, started by Dr. Mary Ainsworth in 1970, where they observed mum and baby in a room with a stranger, and then mum would walk out of the room, and they would observe baby's behavior when she left, what the baby did, and then when mum comes back in. As I mentioned, there's no conscious memory. These are implicit memories before the age of 2, so you know, very hard to self-report on. So, and just because you don't remember something from developmental or attachment trauma, your body does remember and your psyche remembers. And this is why the world-leading expert in trauma, which is Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, head of trauma at the, I think it's the Boston School of Medicine. His book is called The Body Keeps the Score. Time does not heal, it conceals. So he was saying, he's basically been working with the National Centre for Child Traumatic Stress. He says in a survey of 40,000 children nationally being treated for multiple traumas, most of them do not meet the criteria for PTSD. The majority of the issues are not specific traumas, but issues in their attachment relationships. So just as a bit more depth of knowledge about this as well, with developmental or attachment trauma, it's when you don't attach with mum properly, you end up with core shame, lack of feelings of self-love, problems with mood and attention happen, there's difficulties regulating emotions and self-soothing. As a child and an adult, we go into self-destructive behavior. It leads to problems with relationships, narcissism, codependent relationships in adulthood, in our romantic relationships, mental health problems. This is not like PTSD, where the key issue is people have flashbacks, there's a numbing, anxiety, they have triggering events, sleeplessness, also withdrawal. And the diagnosis of PTSD requires being a victim or witnessing a physical life-threatening event. That's not true for relational trauma. So here's the study, here's the key study I want people to have to know about. So between this is Mary Ainsworth's work, Strange Situation Studies, 1970 to 1999, over 6,000 parent infants were observed. What did they find? Only 55% of babies have secure attachment, which means that when mum leaves, they cry. When she comes back, they're happy. Mum calms baby down and she returns, or he returns to play. These babies are securely attached. Now, unfortunately, 23% of babies are avoidant, which means they have no reaction when mum leaves, no reaction when mum comes back in the room. And the research has found that mum is actually not expressing emotionally or expressing love to those children. She's even on rejecting, and that could be a multiple set of reasons. She may be dealing with trauma herself. She may be dealing with abuse in her life. She may have also, by the way, not had this in her own childhood and had a failure to bond with her mother. 22% are ambivalent or disorganized, and these are babies who are kind of, when mum comes back in the room, they're kind of anxious, angry, they kind of calm down for a bit and then they go back into anger and anxiousness. And this is where the mum tends to be attuned sometimes, not others. So she's kind of misattuned, and this is where babies are kind of anxious, and they have what's called anxious attachment. So it's called ambivalent disorganized. Essentially, as of 2017, it's probably 50% of adults. This is a blockbuster figure. 50% of adults are probably unable to create secure, happy, loving relationships, which is phenomenal. And the thing is, this definitely, how we attach in childhood impacts how we attach in adulthood. So this is with the Mary Ainsworth's student Mary Main created the Adult Attachment Interview, which now has been done with over 10,000 adults, over 25 years up to 2009, where they essentially confirmed the same statistics. So you can ask an adult how their childhood was, and they came out as saying, yeah, 23% were dismissing, that's the avoidant types, about only 58% were secure. So this is 10,000 adults that have been confirmed. So this is, you know, still going on. How important is our relationships? Okay, here's a landmark study in 2004. Social support was a stronger predictor of survival than physical activity, body mass index, hypertension, air pollution, alcohol consumption, and even smoking 15 cigarettes a day. This was of over 300,000 participants. So what we want to know is, are the people that we're working with, did they have attachment trauma? And are they having difficulties in their relationships now? Because that is having a major impact on their stress levels. So the strange situation studies, obviously, you know, it's out of the scope of a questionnaire. How would we assess in our adults, you know, to check this? The adult assessment questionnaire, it takes 75 minutes to complete by the participant, 10 hours to transcribe, 4 hours to assess how the person is responding. So it's just, you know, it takes a lot to work that out about what somebody's attachment style is. By the way, the adult attachment interview is 85% accurate in predicting how the adult will attach with their own child. So if they are dismissive in their own childhood, they'll have a dismissive relationship and avoidant relationship with their own child. So the ACE questionnaire, you see, there's only 2 questions in the ACE questionnaire that covered that, and this is how much it takes to actually assess attachment trauma, and it's a huge contribution to the overall picture. So this is why, you know, it's so important that really everybody's affected by emotional trauma in childhood, whether it was a specific incident or it's relational. Child's brain develops in a social context. The brain doesn't develop in an isolated, closed system. It actually, neural pathways develop in response to the connection with the primary caregiver. So, and this is to do with the self or brain as changed by the other. And there's something called mirror neurons that develop in response to, you know, kind of observing others' intentional actions. So essentially, if somebody who's insecurely attached is going to have a stress response for the rest of their life. They're on a high level of stress response. So, you know, attachment styles and cortisol levels is now a huge expanding area. The anxious, disorganized attachment types have high heart rate, high cortisol levels. The babies have that, and the adults have a higher stress response in response to adult sort of recreated stresses. So if you've not bonded with one properly, you're going to be a more stressed person in adulthood. This has also been, there's some mixed results with the avoidant dismissive types. Researchers have found that the babies that were avoidant, that just ignored mum when she came and left, the babies actually have got just as higher heart rate and higher cortisol as their anxious group, as the anxious group as well. So, and it's a little bit mixed about this type in adulthood. Narcissism, it tends to come from dismissive attachment styles, and they've been found to have like a stress response as well. So essentially, if you're not securely attached, the chances are you're more prone to stress and you're likely to have a higher stress response in adulthood. This is start of what we're starting to unpick, why, if you have trauma in childhood, it's correlated with so many chronic complex illnesses and reduction in life expectancy. And you know, one of the most robust findings in the science of psychoneuroimmunology is that there's a strong correlation between close personal relationships and immune function. You know, P&I researchers have found that social isolation, lack of social integration, and interpersonal conflict are associated with increased inflammatory markers. So I just wanted to cover that because really I don't think there's anybody who is not impacted by ACEs. And that's why the 67% was an underestimate. Really, you need to be considering this in every single person who comes to see you who has some kind of chronic ailment or illness, because there's bound to be emotional stress that is contributing to this overall clinical picture. So let's get into the details now about how does childhood biography become adult biology. I cover 3 core mechanisms, okay? So this is where you'll know how to kind of address it. First is behavior, second is the biochemistry of early life stress, and third is the beliefs and emotions and identity and the impact of ACEs on those. In terms of behavior, when you have ACEs in childhood, you're much more likely to have destructive behavior patterns. We covered that with this relational trauma. So self-destructive health patterns include things like people with 4 or more ACEs are more than 12 times as likely to attempt suicide, we mentioned, more than 10 times as likely to use injection drugs, more than 7 times as likely to be an alcoholic. This is that 28,000 person survey in California. You're almost 3 times as likely to be a current smoker with 4 ACEs, more than 3 times as likely to engage in binge drinking, and over 3 times as likely to engage in risky sexual behavior. So clearly, you know, you've had a rough childhood, there's emotional pain, and we look at addictive, destructive health patterns because we're not able to regulate our emotions properly, because we haven't created those mirror neurons which help us to self-soothe because we didn't connect with our caregiver. Or we've had, you know, an incident, a physical incident that's kept our whole body on high alert. But the 17,500 survey, the 1998 one, showed you can have normal cholesterol, normal weight, not smoke, not drink, not be diabetic, and still have a 360% increased risk of heart disease if you've had 7 ACEs. So it's not just the impact on behavior, which obviously creates destructive health patterns which would lead to those high correlated chronic complex illness onset, but you could be healthy and still have a problem. So what's going on? This was also found with lung cancer and ACEs. So smoking wasn't enough. It's only partially explained by smoking, suggesting that other possible mechanisms by which ACEs are contributing to the onset of lung cancer. So this is where we start to look at some of the biochemistry and some really kind of cutting-edge research that's world-class that we should all understand. Hopefully a lot of us remember this study covering epigenetics that was really the landmark study in epigenetics by the brilliant Dr. Randy Jertle. Here's the agouti mice. Here's 2 mice, the same species. The mum of the brown one was fed methyl donors in their diet, so things like choline, B12, and the baby came out with brown skin. It lives longer and it's healthy. The one on the left didn't get the methyl donors, so the expression of the DNA was different, the epigenetics were different during the mama's diet or during when this little part was in the mum's tummy. And so this yellow one dies faster than the brown one. It has heart disease, dies of cancer, it's obese. So that's the one that didn't get the methyl donors. So this was a big study at the time. It founded, you know, epigenetics. So there's a couple of researchers. It was a neuroscientist and a geneticist who said if diet and chemicals could create epigenetic changes, could human behavior in childhood neglect or severe early stress change epigenetics in brain neurons? Okay. So they got together. It was Michael Meany and Moshe, the geneticist, while working at McGill University in Montreal, 2004, discovered, looking at rats, okay, it was a rat model, the type and amount of nurturing a mother rat provides in the early weeks of the rat's infancy determines how that rat responds to stress later in life. Same study, nurturing behaviors from the mother rat were found to stimulate activation of stress signaling pathways that remove methyl groups from the DNA in the glucocorticoid receptor gene. This releases the tightly wound gene, exposes it for transcription. The glucocorticoid gene is activated, resulting in a lower stress response. Rat pups, essentially, that receive less nurturing upbringing are more sensitive to stress throughout their lifespan. Replicated in humans, they actually looked at people who had committed suicide and found that the glucocorticoid receptors were definitely expressing differently in those adults who'd actually had ACEs in childhood. So essentially what's happening is the epigenetic expression is changing of those glucocorticoid receptors, triggering a cascading effect on the entire HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, where we're triggered to have, we need less stress to cause us to have a reaction and a higher response throughout a lifetime. And the researchers are saying essentially a critical brake is switched off. The child is marinating in stress hormones and inflammatory cytokines from a young age, and they have a lowered threshold response to stressors. So they have a reduced resilience. So as adults, you know, we have inevitable stresses that happen to us in adulthood, loss of job, divorce, all these kinds of things, but we're going to be less resilient if we've had ACEs in childhood. Important to say, it was not just one gene they found changed with ACEs in childhood. It'd be nice, you know, it's this conventional medical approach if it's like a one-shot cure, they're just looking for one gene. No, it's not just one gene that was found to be epigenetically changed by ACEs in childhood. Dr. Joan Kaufman's work from Yale University, I think she's involved with Yale Medical School. Child maltreatment was associated with widespread differences in methylation across the entire genome. So it involved genomes, you know, genes that involved with biological processes relevant in psychiatric and substance abuse disorders, heart disease, stroke, respiratory disease, diabetes, and cancer. So it's the entire genome which is changed by early life stress. These are some fascinating studies. They actually recreated attachment trauma. So maternal separation in monkeys actually changes the integrity of the intestinal microflora. That would have been translated starting in the amygdala, starting in the brain, cascading through the HPA axis, changing the way the digestive enzymes are expressing the stress hormones, and there we have it, changing the gut flora. Same with rats, irritable, alters behavior, immunity in the microbiota in rats with early life stress, the same thing was found. Also prenatal stress, changes the bacterial colonization in monkeys. Nutritional approach, again, neonatal stress in rats causes intestinal barrier dysfunction. So, you know, it is affecting everything. I could go on and on about how the early life stress affects different parts of the body. We know that once the brain is kind of kindled, so the limbic system, which is the emotional processing part of the brain, is set off in this lowered threshold response, so it's stresses more easily. The microglia in the brain, which are part of the immune system, cells of the immune system in the brain, in response to chronic stress, quote unquote, go berserk. That's what the researchers said. So this is how it is thought to lead to Alzheimer's and brain disorders. So the microglia actually end up pruning too many of the brain cells. So that's the link to Alzheimer's. You know, really, because the stress response, stress affects all areas of the body, and really how it's going to affect somebody, I guess, depends on this kind of genetic weak link in the chain. But some people have ACEs in childhood and it might be their brain's more affected, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, this kind of thing. Other people, it may affect their gut more for genetic reasons, so they go on to kind of the autoimmune side of things, IBD, IBS, Crohn's, this kind of thing. Other people may be, it could be those sensitivity genes, and they go on to get chronic fatigue syndrome, and eventually that impacts mitochondrial function. Other people, they get heart disease. So just where's the genetic weak link in the chain? Because the chronic stress response is the common factor in all of it. Just as a quick summary about, you know, the vicious cycle of stress. So what's actually happening here is we're having the person is kindled, they are set up, their neural pathways, people with early life stress are set up to have this chronic stress response since childhood. That's the emotional stress. It's interesting that the heart will actually pick up emotional stress or an emotionally stressing incident before the brain does. Heart rate variability, it captures the event a millisecond before the brain. There's more afferent nerves going up to the brain than there is vice versa. So if you like, the heart senses there's an issue, tells the amygdala there's a problem. The amygdala will process this, and it will do two things. It will set off the sympathetic nervous system and set off the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus will speak to the adrenals via the pituitary. This is just 101, hopefully, for most people. And the adrenals will start pumping out the cortisol over time. That will lead to adrenal exhaustion, inflammation, free radical increase, internal toxicity, anxiety, less sleep. And we've got the adrenaline being pumped out there and being stuck in essentially being stuck in fight-flight mode. Now, if the body's stuck chronically in fight and flight, we're now having endogenous sources of stress. So, because we know that the HPA axis in the brain doesn't differentiate between chemical, electrical, psychological, microbial stressors, physical stressors. If the body now has internal toxicity and, you know, kind of free radical damage and things like this going on internally, that is now sending an additional message to the amygdala saying there's a problem, there's a problem, there's a problem, even though maybe the emotional trauma isn't there anymore. So that's how the vicious cycle continues. This is a brilliant paper if anybody's interested in chronic fatigue syndrome. It was called Kindling and Oxidative Stress as Contributors to Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, also known as myalgic encephalomyelitis. He really explains limbic kindling, the cascading impact that that has on the entire HPA axis through to developing mitochondrial dysfunction. And it's really the paper, it's written by Dr. Leonard Jason, who's the world leading expert in the case definition of chronic fatigue. It's a great paper to help understand. I mean, chronic fatigue syndrome is probably an extreme state of chronic stress. It's a process of stress, and in severe cases is very, very debilitating. So it's, if you really want to understand how stress works and how ACEs work, just study chronic fatigue syndrome. It's what I did for like 10 years, and how I got to understand how the stress response works. This paper, according to kindling theory, repeated exposure to an initially sub-threshold stimulus can eventually exceed threshold limits, resulting in persistent hypersensitivity to the stimulus and ultimately spontaneous behavioral manifestations. It means that a one-off stress or an intermittent stressor as a childhood kindles the brain, so it's stuck in an excitatory state, it's stuck, it's the body's, the organism, the body-brain is stuck in this fight-flight response. So this is the last section of just how a childhood autobiography becomes adult biology. This is a very important area to understand how ACEs affect beliefs and identity. So we know there's the placebo. We also have nocebo. 33% of all healing occurs in drug trials now due to the placebo effect, which is a strong, positive, optimistic belief that some things that we take was actually going to make us better. But we also have something called the nocebo effect. And the way that, for example, here's the Framingham Heart Study, women who believed they were prone to heart disease were nearly 4 times as likely to die as women with similar risk factors who did not believe. Now the issue is with trauma in childhood, there's often unresolved, unconscious belief systems and thoughts going on that will sabotage your clients' best intentions for what they're trying to do with their health. And they could be completely compliant, they could be doing a great job sticking to everything you've said, but if they have an unconscious belief going on that is that they don't deserve health, that it's not safe to be healthy, it's going to sabotage what you're doing on the biochemistry side, because the mind is so powerful. And I mentioned, you know, trauma in childhood is, it changes our identity and our sense of self. The shame is semi-conscious in most people. Most of it, a lot of it's not conscious. So that's why, you know, digging into some of the psychology stuff can be really important. This is a fascinating sort of thing to know. The original ACEs study actually started in an obesity clinic with Dr. Fleety at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego. It was a weight loss clinic, and they were doing great with their clients and patients, but they were getting a 55% dropout rate. So the patients were doing really well and then suddenly were dropping out. And as they were losing weight, they were getting more and more anxious. And so they actually decided to interview and find out what's the problem, why are people dropping out? And they found out by mistake that a lot of people self-reported being sexually abused in childhood. And the one woman kind of summed it up when she said being fat was a protection mechanism. It protected against unwanted attention. So just think about this. This is where it was unsafe for her to follow your dietary recommendations because she had unresolved trauma in childhood. So this is where there's so many sabotaging sort of things going on. If you don't know about your client's history, this is to do with compliance, right? They're never going to be able to comply. They can't just do the healthy things they need to do because of the trauma. We very much found this with chronic fatigue, and this will affect multiple other types of illnesses as well. In chronic fatigue syndrome, we identified certain personality types. We found it was the perfectionist, the giver, but the performer, also known as the achiever type, and the anxiety type, which is actually number 6. This is the Enneagram system that you're looking at here, the Enneagram of 9 personality types. It's a system used by a lot of psychologists and businesses. It's had a long history behind it, and the reason we use this typing system is because it types people not by what they do, not by what their behavior is, their external behavior, but why they do it. So we're actually getting into attachment trauma issues. So, you know, achiever types will have had some form of attachment disorder where they didn't get the inherent love and connection from the primary caregiver. So essentially the message they got from their caregivers is I have to achieve, I have to do stuff to be okay because I'm not inherently lovable. So they overachieve, and essentially the anxiety types didn't get the support they needed to feel safe and loved. The giver types are fascinating. With the giver types, they tend to be a lot of mums, tons of therapists are the giver types, where essentially they didn't inherently get emotional love. They found that they could earn it by giving to other people. So they don't inherently feel love, but if they found that when they helped the caregiver or the people around them, suddenly they got love back. So they learned to be conditionally, to express themselves conditionally. And perfectionists essentially were highly criticized and were told they only had a right or wrong way of doing things. That's the message they got from parents. If you do this wrong, you're not lovable. If you do it right, you're lovable. So essentially all those behaviors lead to chronic overachieving, overworking. This group doesn't know how to stop and relax naturally. They will feel huge amounts of shame and guilt if they can't fulfill the identity needs that they have. And this is one of the hugest reasons why people end up with chronic fatigue or a multitude of any other types of illnesses that are coming from chronic stress, with the body breaking down because you simply aren't relaxing. So essentially from the attachment trauma, there's a core shame and abandonment that is experienced. Essentially it's self-love deficit disorder. This is leading into the kind of more subtle destructive health patterns where, you know, you will binge eat on foods. It's interesting that so many therapists, for example, like will give themselves away so much to everybody else to the point they end up in my clinic because they've got chronic fatigue. So, you know, it comes in many shapes and forms. It's not just about, you know, these obvious external behaviors like binge drinking or becoming an alcoholic. It's so subtle in all of us, and all of us have some level or degree of this really going on. So early trauma, it shapes your entire personality. By the way, there is a book on the giver type called The Drama of the Gifted Child. It was legendary by Alice Miller. And I've just mentioned it because it describes how so many therapists actually have attachment trauma. That's why they became healers and therapists. But so this is hopefully will give you an idea about what you're dealing with. You know, if you're just dealing with somebody from the biochemical paradigm and you're not actually looking at what's driving their behavior and how they might be sabotaging that, you're going to be missing out on so much. You won't be able to expectation manage with your clients. You'll be able to give them biochemistry stuff, but everything they're doing on the psychology side is forcing the biology in the opposite direction. So this is key stuff to know about. So a summary on this, I say the future is the past healed. So most adults don't realize the large part of their emotional response to stress as an adult is dictated by their childhood experiences. A childhood sets the bar for our adult resilience to the inevitable life stresses that we're going to face. Most health practitioners are not ACE aware, and stress is assessed very superficially. Recommendations are usually inadequate. So it's vital to have some sense of the subjective landscape and history of your patient if you want the full picture. Steps, this is the final section. Okay, I am on time for the final section. How, you know, obviously this is a huge topic. I can't, you know, tell you everything that you need to do in clinic to address this, but we could certainly cover some of the basics. So essentially what we're trying to do, why are we looking at the subjective state of the patient and looking at trauma in the past and childhood? Really, we just need our patients to get into what we call the healing state. And if they have unresolved trauma, if their amygdala in their brain is now neurally set up to be in a chronic state of stress, whatever their illness is, whatever you're doing with them on the biochemistry side is not going to be as effective as if their body is actually in a calm, untraumatized state, which we could call the healing state, the parasympathetic side, the rest, digest, detoxify state. If your patient is in fight and flight, you're just not going to get the same results with what you do on the biochemistry, because that will, the essentially the psychology and the emotional aspect is pushing things in the opposite direction. So it's the essence of what we're trying to do. So you're probably thinking, oh my God, do I have to start training in multiple modalities? Do I need to go through, do a 3-year psychology degree? The big answer to that is absolutely no. It's your awareness that counts. So it's knowing about what's going on with somebody so that you can refer away. Because most of us are absolutely not qualified to deal with some of the levels of trauma that may be going on with our patients. But your awareness that this could be impacting the patient is what's key. The best way, the top thing I can recommend that practitioners start to do is research and explore your own ACEs, your own personality issues, your own attachment history. Because once you start doing that, you start finding out what your Enneagram is and so on, your whole world will shift because you'll start to notice, things when your patient comes in the room or your client comes in the room, how they deal with you on the phone, how they deal with your protocol. There'll be so much more information available to you without you even adding anything. Because you just know about, oh, that's the behavior of an achiever type, this is the behavior of an anxiety type, and so forth. If you are going to, I do recommend bringing in the ACE questionnaire, get your patients to start doing the Enneagram. I'll show you how people can also even start looking at attachment trauma issues. If you are going to do that, patient education or your client education is key. So, if you are a practitioner who, has a blog site, or maybe you do podcasts, or maybe it's just a handout, where you educate your patient on the data. So, go to my website, take the data, go to the ACE studies, look at the data, put it into your own words, create an article, and show your patients, like, did you know, if a patient's coming to see you with autoimmunity that, it's a strongly correlated, ACEs in childhood are strongly correlated to smoking and lung cancer. Maybe this is something you might want to look into. So education is key because obviously, you're going to be asking potentially intimate questions. And the ACEs questionnaire, who's going to say they were sexually abused in childhood, in the first consultation? People do with me. They email me and say, I have 4 ACEs, but it's only because I'm out there educating all the time. I get people coming to me all the time saying, I've had 10 ACEs, I've done everything I could in the functional medicine community, and I didn't realize, and you told me to read this book, and I cried all the way through, and I'm like, okay, right. So yes, you could bring in these types of assessments. Then you want to create a trusted referral network, or you might be working as part of a provider team. So, maybe you're already working with an MD and there's also an energy medicine practitioner, and maybe there needs to be a psych practitioner as well. Of course, you can go and train if you want in these psychology techniques. There's people like Mark Hyman and Dr. McCullough who do EFT tapping and all kinds of things. If it makes your heart sing and you could see yourself doing that kind of work with clients, get your appropriate insurance, appropriate sign-offs, to work in that way, and go for it. There's Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt who's got a degree in psychology, medical doctor, energy practitioner, that these people exist. Depends how you personally want to work. Obviously, your skills around rapport, being compassionate, non-judgmental, and so on, it goes without saying they need to be top-notch if you are going to be gently starting to get people to start considering that this could be impacting on their health. So, so in terms of the ACE score, if you want to bring this into your clinical practice, there's the questionnaire, the original ACE score from the original ACE studies, the link's right there. I've got the extended one on my website, link right there. If you want to read more research about the science behind ACEs and the biochemistry, this is a brilliant book, Donna Jackson Nakazawa. It's the only real book that's science-orientated about ACEs out there at the moment. Childhood Disrupted is great. If you want to start using an Enneagram questionnaire, this is one of the best books on the topic. The Enneagram Institute is the top institute for it. There's a $12 test called the RETI test you can do to discover someone's Enneagram. You can also do it free online. There's a link there. Assessing attachment styles, there's an assessment called Experiences in Close Relationships Scale. That's the link. You can tell by asking how someone is in their romantic relationships whether they have an issue in childhood. So you can imagine talking to a client and saying, attachment trauma, you could educate them on what that is, and then invite them, it's an invitation. You're never going to tell somebody to do something, an invitation to explore it. How do you feel about looking at, how does this sound to you? Here's some books, 3 books, and if your patients up for it, they would go away and read this. The Human Magnet Syndrome is a superb book. Attached is a very interesting book with a lot of science data in there, and Parenting from the Inside Out is also fantastic. So the Parenting from the Inside Out is Dan Siegel, Dr. Dan Siegel, the neurologist. He actually has the adult attachment questionnaire also in that book that is kind of reconstituted so that you could give it to your patients and it's not like research level. And I encourage you guys to look at this too. The good news is that psychology interventions work. We have this thing called neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, synaptogenesis. The brain can be changed. If the brain neural pathways were in the stress response, they can also be reversed. Some of what I call reset rituals, so important to be recommending to your patients. The big 4, meditation, yoga, Tai Chi, and Qigong, are the ones with the most research behind them, showing that you can reduce your stress response, reduces brain excitation, reduces inflammation, 20 minutes twice a day, just things that are getting the patient into a sense of joy and happiness, whatever it is that works for the patient or the client, whatever it might be for them. Recharge rituals, or reset rituals as I call them, these are the types of recommendations that you can be making, and really everybody needs to be doing this every single day, because our lives are so stressful anyway. So if you're not factoring in and scheduling in time, this stuff is lifestyle for the rest of your life. These recommendations, they need to be. It's not something you do for 6 months to recover from autoimmunity. It becomes a way of life. Okay. When it's not enough, so you're going to have patients and clients who can't meditate, who, even though they do all this, they still are having a massive stress response. They're still having all the signs of anxiety and stuck in stress, and maybe their physiological symptoms just aren't improving. If that's still happening and the trauma was early and it was intense, then time to refer. I could go on a lot more about that, and obviously I can't in a 45-minute sort of presentation. So these are the types of therapy that's out there. I won't go into all of them now. I've got a free ebook that NANP are handing out. I've got the resources in the back of that ebook linking to all the websites that relate to all of these. And really, what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another. This is a webinar in itself, so it's usually an exploration process. And I encourage you guys yourselves to explore these, try them out for yourselves so you know how they work, how they've impacted you, and you'll eventually, over time, this is obviously not something you learn to do overnight, but over the months, years, you'll learn what works for what, and you'll actually learn, even for clients, like what type of trauma they have and what you want to refer them for. And the final few slides here, what you're doing on the biochemistry side is extremely important. We need to be reducing the overall allostatic load. The brain and the HPX don't differentiate between electrical, chemical, physical, or microbial emotional stresses. So everything you do in nutrition is so important. You want people to be completing a home chemical, electromagnetic clean up the diet and the lifestyle stresses, address the endogenous sources of stress. Maybe they've got leaky gut, microbial infections, internal toxicity, metabolic imbalances by the time they see you. Become a healer, this is what I say. So if you heal your own trauma, you can heal your patient's field and without doing anything. So the research of heart math shows we have an electromagnetic field around the heart that overlaps with other people's, and that field synchronizes with the fields of people around us. So you can actually make somebody feel better just by being in their presence because you resolved your own trauma before you've even recommended a single treatment. To me, that's becoming a healer as opposed to a technician who's kind of, assessing biochemistry all the time. And the last slide here, become holistic. So instead of just learning more and more about biochemistry, try something new. Try training something in maybe an energy medicine or an Enneagram course, and essentially kind of learn about what we call the unquantified self. It's your subjective state, the last undiscovered country, and essentially it's about knowing thyself. So Thanks, guys. I'm sorry if that was a little fast. You've got the recording. You'll be able to go back, hopefully. Feel free to email me with any questions of things that you maybe didn't pick up on or I went over too fast or anything like that. That's my website, and I think Shannon will be either sending that book out or you can go to my website and download it for free. Thanks, guys.
Great. Wow, thank you. Wow, that was a lot of really interesting information, Nikki. I'm wondering, is through research, are they able to actually monitor or study the effects of like re-imprinting those neural pathways? Can they actually do that? Can they actually show that through these methods, these neural pathways have been have become aware and empowered, and a success through that awareness has been made?
So obviously, you're talking about the psychology interventions, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, you know something's improving. You're going to know somebody's getting that because their behavior changes and they're feeling better and they're kind of, actually healing. So obviously, you're basing it on that. But you'd have to dig into the research. One of the top interventions for trauma right now that Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is talking about is neurofeedback. And one of the ways that they're trying to raise tons of money for research at the moment, but one of the things they've been tracking is neurofeedback for children who've been very traumatized. The children will draw pictures of their parents or their caregivers and their family, and then they're comparing the pictures after 20 sessions of neurofeedback. And that's one of the ways that they've been actually being able to assess. You could actually technically assess that. And Bessel van der Kolk, for example, saying that neurofeedback is out and out one of the top sort of forms of resolving trauma, because after 20 to 40 seconds of neurofeedback, the skills and the ability of the children are just beyond anything. They'll be doing MRI, kind of imaging as well for that type of thing. There are studies out there already showing that, and they're trying to do more. But obviously, there's a lot of different types of studies out there. Some it's going to be clearly self-reported symptoms of shifting, but there'll be certainly as well with EMDR and CBT. Those are both kind of fairly mainstream interventions. There are MRIs of befores and afters. If you're talking about those kind of technical, imaging of MRI scans and brain scans and things like that as well. There's work with EFT. I don't think it's as technical. The research around that is more around the children showing clear signs of no longer expressing trauma in their behavior and psychology. So there's tons of research. It's kind of I could have done a whole webinar just on that.
Yeah. How you condensed it all into this short time was really remarkable. Thank you for doing that. Well, I hope that we can do some more webinars with you in the future. These are some very interesting behavioral topics that, as nutrition professionals, we're dealing with and working with. So I hope that our audience was able to get a good amount of information and some ideas of where to go and where to look into and some of the research that's been done. One of the questions that we've got are, have there been any, has there shown any differences between emotional and psychological ACEs with physical attributes like homelessness or financial status, those types of things, more of the kind of cultural impacts?
Okay, I'm not sure I 100% understand the question. So there is, if you're talking about socioeconomic status, there's tons. I mean, there's tons of studies out there. So there's, if you want to have socioeconomic status correlated with adult onset of chronic diseases, you can find studies on that which will show definitely that socioeconomic status impacts health. There's also definitely different types of studies depending on kind of what illnesses you want to look at. there's plenty of studies sort of looking at different types of ACEs. So some of them will look purely at the relational trauma and the impact on health, and others are looking at more, just say, PTSD qualifying type ACEs, and others just purely looking at socioeconomic impact. So those studies are there. There's so much in the kind of what we call the developmental psychology area. It's the most underexposed area of huge amounts of research that most physically focused, sort of biochemical focused practitioners just don't know about. You know, if we kind of think of stress, we think about it very superficially generally. Even in the functional medicine community, we don't really go into the depth that's possible, and as far as the developmental psychology world has gone into. And the data's there. The data's there. We should be looking at this, because if you just look at the ACEs study, you know, we need to go deeper than just saying, you know, you're a bit stressed today because you've got too many emails, and, you know, just go and have the cup of tea and calm down. You know, you'll be fine. You know, that kind of stuff. When somebody needs to deal with attachment trauma, you know, I just encourage, I'm trying to just raise awareness about it and get people more aware. There's an awful lot more going on this side.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being with us today, sharing the data that you've pulled together, the great work that you're doing, and helping us to become more aware of, you know, just the depth of where these things are coming from. So, Niki, thank you. I hope we can come back and do this again. I know you've got quite a few topics. We've got your email and your website there, so if anybody has questions, they can contact Niki. Thank you, Niki, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. So just to let you know, next month we will have another great speaker. We'll have Sherry Strong, who is going to be talking about holistic nutrition business and the skills to sustain a holistic business and the 3 critical mistakes to avoid struggling or burnout. I hope you have a great rest of your day and enjoy.